The final nail in her old life was the sound of the door closing. It was not slammed in anger, but shut with a quiet, final click that echoed the closing of a coffin lid. Elara stood on the porch of the home she had shared with her husband, Jacob, watching his brother Marcus turn the key in the lock. The funeral had been yesterday. The reading of the will had been this morning. Now it was over. Marcus did not meet her eyes. He was a man made of ledgers and sharp angles, and sentiment was a currency he did not trade in. He pressed a small, worn leather pouch into her palm. The coins inside were few and cold. "The law is the law, Elara," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "Jacob's debts were substantial. The farm covers them. This is what is left." He then handed her a folded piece of paper, the ink already fading. It was a deed. "And this, it was our grandfather's folly, a worthless plot up on Stone Ridge. Nobody's wanted it for 50 years. But it is land, and it was his, so now it is yours." He finally looked at her, his gaze holding not malice, but a profound and dismissive pity. "You should sell it for whatever you can get. A few dollars, perhaps. Go east. Find work in a factory." She looked down at what she possessed. $27 in the pouch. A deed to a place everyone called worthless. The clothes she wore were sturdy but patched. Her husband's axe, its hickory handle worn smooth by his hands, leaned against the porch rail, and at her feet a scruffy, grizzled dog named Silas, Jacob's loyal shadow, whined softly, pressing his head against her leg. That was all, the sum of her life. The town of Providence Gulch watched her walk toward the mercantile. Their sympathy was a thin, brittle thing, easily shattered by the inconvenience of a widow with nothing. They saw a woman erased, first by death, now by law. They expected her to fail. They expected her to break. Inside the mercantile, Mr. Gable polished the counter with a practiced, circular motion. He was the town's barometer, a man who measured the worth of his neighbors by the weight of their coin and the quality of their credit. He listened to her request for supplies, his expression impassive. When she produced the deed to pay for a portion, he let out a short, sharp laugh that was more like a cough. "The old Miller plot?" he scoffed, pushing the paper back across the counter as if it were contaminated. "Child, that's not land. It's a curse. Nothing but rock and wind. There's an old collapsed root cellar up there they call the Widow's Hole. Fitting, I suppose." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Take my advice. Forget the land. Your $27 will buy you a stagecoach ticket to someplace civilized. There's nothing for you here." Elara looked at his face, at the comfortable certainty etched into his features. She saw the same dismissal she had seen in her brother-in-law's eyes. A quiet fire, cold and hard as flint, sparked within her. She pushed the deed back. "I am not selling," she said, her voice low but clear. "I will need a shovel, a good one, and a sack of potatoes, a bag of salt, and 10 pounds of nails." A hush fell over the few customers in the store. Gable stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. This was not the broken widow they expected. This was something else. He weighed the nails, sacked the potatoes, and took her money, his movements stiff with disapproval. As she left, the axe over one shoulder, the heavy sack over the other, and Silas trotting faithfully behind, she heard him mutter to another man, "She's digging her own grave." She did not look back. She turned her face away from the town, away from the fertile valley and the life she had known, and began the long walk toward Stone Ridge. The weight on her shoulder was immense, but it was a solid, physical burden. It was nothing compared to the weight of their pity, and she was glad to leave that behind. The journey was a pilgrimage into desolation. The path dwindled from a wagon-rutted track to a faint deer trail winding through rock and stunted pine. The air grew thinner, colder. The wind was a constant presence, a thief that stole the warmth from her bones and whispered of failure in her ears. Silas stayed so close, his fur brushed against her leg with every step, a silent, comforting anchor in the vast, indifferent landscape. By the time she reached the plot marked on the deed, the sun was low, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. The land was exactly as they had described it, a barren, wind-swept slope of granite and shale, where only the hardiest weeds and gnarled trees could survive. There was no shelter, no flat ground, no sign of life. There was only the wind and the rock. And there, in the middle of it all, was the widow's hole. It was not a cellar. It was a scar, a shallow depression in the earth, maybe 20 feet across, choked with the gray, splintered timbers of a collapsed roof, piles of frost-heaved stones, and the skeletal remains of long-dead shrubs. It was a picture of absolute abandonment. It was hopeless. For a long moment, Ilara stood at the edge of the pit, the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. The strength that had carried her from the town dissolved into a cold, hollow dread. Gable was right. Marcus was right. The whole world was right. This was a grave. Tears, hot and sharp, welled in her eyes, freezing on her cheeks. Her knees felt weak, and she sank to the ground, the rough sack of supplies a useless weight beside her. Silas nudged her hand, whining with concern, but she could not move. The despair was a physical thing, a paralysis of the soul. She sat there as the light failed, the cold seeping deep into her marrow. This was the end. But as she drew a ragged breath, preparing to surrender to the freezing darkness, she felt something. A faint current of air brushing against her cheek. It was different from the biting wind that tore at the rest of the ridge. This air was not warm, but less cold, and it was damp. It smelled of deep earth, of wet stone and something else, something clean and ancient. Curiosity, the last ember of survival, flickered to life. She crawled to the edge of the collapse, peering into the blackness. The draft was coming from a small opening between two massive, fallen roof beams, a gap leading deeper into the rubble. She reached a hand into the darkness. The air flowing out was consistently, noticeably warmer than the air on the ridge. A surge of adrenaline, stark and powerful, cut through her despair. She grabbed the shovel. The work was brutal. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and cooking, were not ready for this. The splintered wood fought her. The stones were heavy, their edges sharp as knives. For hours she worked by the faint light of a rising moon, driven by a frantic, desperate energy. She heaved timbers aside, rolled stones down the slope, and dug through the compacted dirt. Silas stood guard, a dark silhouette against the stars, occasionally barking into the oppressive silence. Finally, she cleared a narrow passage into the heart of the collapse. She crawled inside, the smell of damp earth enveloping her. The cellar was larger than it had appeared. The back wall was not man-made timber, but a solid cliff face of granite, into which the original cellar had been dug. And from a deep fissure in that stone, the warmer air flowed steadily. Crouching low, she followed the fissure and found its source. A tiny, constant trickle of water seeped from the rock, steaming faintly in the cold. She touched it. It was warm. Not hot, but distinctly, miraculously warm. It was a geothermal spring, a secret pulse of life, deep within the dead mountain. The worthless land had a hidden heart. In that moment, kneeling in the dark, her hands raw and bleeding. Elara did not feel triumph. She felt a grim, unyielding resolve settle into her bones. The town was wrong. This was not a grave. It was a chance. The first week was a blur of savage labor. Her body screamed in protest. Every morning she woke with muscles so stiff she could barely move. Her hands were a ruin of broken blisters and raw flesh. She tore strips from her petticoat to wrap them, but the rough work of hauling stone and digging earth quickly wore through the cloth. She learned to ignore the pain, to let it become a dull, constant companion to the rhythm of her work. Lift, haul, place, repeat. She began by clearing the interior. Bucket by bucket, she hauled out decades of dirt, rubble, and rotten wood. The space began to reveal itself. It was a long, deep rectangle, perhaps 30 feet by 15, with the back third carved directly from the granite of the ridge. This stone wall, she realized, was a massive reservoir of thermal energy. It absorbed the Earth's deep warmth and resisted the fluctuating temperatures of the surface. It was a natural insulator. Her first priority was a roof. The original timbers were too rotted to reuse. Using Jacob's axe, an extension of her will, its familiar weight a comfort, she began the arduous task of felling the tough, scraggly pines that clung to the ridge. Each tree was a battle. The wood was dense, the terrain uneven. She was not a woodcutter, and her swings were often clumsy, but desperation gave her strength. She learned to read the lean of a tree, to cut the wedge just so. The crash of a falling pine was the sound of a small victory against the wilderness. Getting the logs into position was a monumental task. She had no mule, no block and tackle. She used leverage, digging channels and using smaller rocks as fulcrums to roll the heavy timbers to the edge of the pit. One by one, she laid them across the opening, their ends resting on the sturdy stone walls she was building up from the cleared rubble. She packed the gaps between the logs with smaller branches, moss, and then a thick layer of the excavated earth, creating a living roof that would insulate and shed the rain. As the shelter took shape, she turned her attention to the interconnected systems that would keep her alive. The warm spring was the heart of it all. She carefully chipped a channel in the stone floor, guiding the constant trickle of water away from her living space and into a deep basin she dug in the corner. She lined this cistern with a thick layer of clay she found near the base of the ridge, pounding it smooth and watertight. Now she had a permanent source of clean, unfrozen water, shielded from the elements. Heat was next. She built a small, squat fireplace and chimney near the new entrance, using flat stones and a mortar of clay and sand. It was not elegant, but it drew well. The true genius of her system, however, was passive. The geothermal heat from the fissure and the thermal mass of the rock walls kept the ambient temperature of the cellar consistently above freezing, even without a fire. The fireplace was for cooking and for fighting back the bitterest cold, but the earth itself provided the baseline of survival. The most audacious part of her plan was the garden. While the townspeople above ground prepared for winter, surrendering their fields to the coming frost, Elara was preparing to plant. In the back of the cellar, where the geothermal warmth was strongest, she began to build garden beds. This required hauling soil. For days, she carried bucket after bucket of the richer topsoil from a sheltered hollow at the foot of the ridge up the punishing slope and down into her subterranean world. She filled 3 long, shallow beds with the dark, fragrant earth. There, in the dim light of her single lantern, she planted the seed potatoes she had bought from Gable. Beside them, she sowed rows of carrots, turnips, and hardy kale. It was an act of faith, planting seeds in near darkness, trusting the warmth of the earth to be enough. A month into her labor, she knew she needed more. Her supplies were dwindling, and she needed a source of protein that did not rely on the uncertainty of her snares. She walked back to Providence Gulch. Her appearance caused a stir. She was thinner, her face weathered by wind and sun, her hands calloused and scarred. Her dress was stained with dirt and pine pitch. She looked feral, wild. She walked into Gable's Mercantile with a quiet confidence that unsettled him. She did not ask for credit. She laid 3 rabbits, skinned and cleaned, on the counter. "A trade," she said, "for 2 laying hens and a sack of feed." Gable stared at the rabbits, then at her. He saw the raw determination in her eyes, and it angered him. It was a rebuke to his sensible, pragmatic world. "What's a woman in a hole in the ground need with chickens?" he sneered, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Are you expecting them to burrow for worms?" Laughter rippled through the customers. A new nickname was born. No longer just the widow, she was now the folly girl, the cave girl. He made the trade, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. Leading 2 squawking hens on leashes made of twine back to Stone Ridge was a new kind of trial. They fought her every step, flapping and struggling. But she got them there. She built them a small, secure coop in a corner of the cellar, where they were protected from the cold and predators. When she found the first, small, perfect brown egg in the nesting box a week later, she held it in her palm and felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost brought her to tears. It was a small miracle of warmth and life, created in the dark heart of the mountain. Silas was the silent witness to it all. He was her guard, her companion, her only comfort. He watched her work, his head on his paws. He walked the perimeter of their small territory each morning and evening, his low growls warning away unseen creatures in the night. When she finally collapsed onto her simple bed of pine boughs and blankets, he would lie beside her, a warm, breathing presence in the profound solitude. She talked to him constantly, telling him about her plans for the walls, the garden, the door. His attentive gaze and the occasional thump of his tail were her only response, but it was enough. He broke the crushing silence and reminded her that she was not entirely alone. He was a link to her past, to Jacob, and a guardian of her fragile future. As autumn bled into winter, the mockery from the town solidified into a local legend. The story of the folly girl living in the widow's hole became a cautionary tale told over hearth fires in Providence Gulch. Brant, a grizzled trapper whose confidence was as vast as the wilderness he roamed, made a special trip up to her land just to see the spectacle for himself. He found her chinking the final gaps in her heavy wooden door with a mixture of mud and grass. He stood there, leaning on his rifle, a smirk playing on his lips. "Heard you were digging to China," he said, his voice thick with condescension. "You'll be a block of ice before the first real snow, girl. This ridge ain't forgiving. Best come down and beg for a spot by someone's fire while you still can." Elara didn't stop her work. She pressed the thick mud into a crack, smoothing it with her scarred fingers. "I have my own fire," she said, not looking at him. His laughter followed him back down the trail, but it felt distant, irrelevant. His world was out there, in the wind and the cold. Her world was in here. The deep winter descended. The world outside her shelter shrank, becoming a howling white expanse. Inside, her life settled into a disciplined, quiet rhythm. Her days were governed not by the sun, which she barely saw, but by the essential tasks of survival. Each morning began in the soft glow of the lantern. First, the fire. She would add logs she had cut and stacked against the inner wall, the crackle and pop a cheerful sound in the stillness. Then she tended the animals. The 2 hens, whom she had named Hope and Mercy, clucked to greeting as she brought them their meager ration of feed and fresh water from the cistern. Their health was paramount. Their daily eggs were her most precious resource. Next, the garden. In the consistent, gentle warmth, her subterranean plants grew slowly but steadily. The potato vines flourished, pale but strong. The kale was a deep, miraculous green. She watered them carefully, turning the soil, whispering words of encouragement to the tiny shoots. It was a bizarre, beautiful sight, a vibrant green garden thriving underground while the world above was locked in ice. The days were for maintenance and fortification. She carved shelves into a section of the dirt wall for storing her preserved food. She set her snares in the sheltered gullies of the ridge, checking them daily. A caught rabbit was a feast that would last for days. She spent hours mending her clothes, sharpening the axe, weaving a sleeping mat from dried grasses. There was no wasted time, no wasted motion. Her world was a closed loop of effort and sustenance, and she was its sole, sovereign ruler. Her isolation was absolute. Weeks went by without the sight of another human being. The silence was broken only by the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the soft sounds of the animals. Yet she did not feel lonely. She felt present. Every action had an immediate and tangible consequence. If she did not chop wood, she would be cold. If she did not tend the garden, she would starve. This stark clarity was a kind of freedom. Her systems faced their first real tests. A pack of gaunt, hungry wolves, drawn by the scent of the chickens, circled her shelter for 2 nights. Their howls were a chilling symphony just outside her door. Silas stood rigid, a low, constant growl in his chest, his presence at the door a formidable deterrent. The heavy, reinforced door held firm. The wolves, unable to find a weakness, eventually moved on. Later, an ice storm coated the ridge in a thick, heavy glaze. A section of the earthen roof, weighed down by the ice, began to sag ominously. For 2 days, she worked in the freezing sleet, building a series of external supports from heavy stones and logs to buttress the weakened section. It was grueling, miserable work that left her chilled to the bone, but she finished it. The shelter held. Each small crisis overcome was a lesson learned, a weakness identified and fortified. She was not just surviving, she was adapting, hardening, becoming as resilient as the tough, gnarled pines that clung to her ridge. Then came the great storm. It was not a normal blizzard. It arrived like an invading army, announced by a sky the color of a deep bruise and a wind that did not howl, but screamed. The old-timers in Providence Gulch would later call it the Blizzard of '83, a name spoken with the same reverence and terror reserved for a great flood or fire. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring wall of white that erased the world. It piled in monstrous drifts, burying fences, then sheds, then entire cabins. The temperature plummeted, a descent into a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight. It was a cold that broke things. It split wood, shattered glass, and stole the life from any living thing left exposed. In Providence Gulch, confidence shattered first, then everything else. The town was built for normal winters, not for this Arctic monster. Roofs, designed to hold a foot of snow, began to groan and splinter under the impossible weight of 10. The mercantile's large plate-glass windows, Mr. Gable's pride, cracked with reports as loud as gunshots, allowing the razor-sharp wind to tear through the store. Firewood, stockpiled for a season, vanished in a matter of days as every hearth burned day and night. Families huddled together, feeding their fires with chairs, tables, floorboards. Livestock, trapped in barns, began to die, their water troughs frozen solid, their bodies stiffening in the stalls. The community's sense of order and safety collapsed into a desperate, house-by-house struggle for warmth. The town was a collection of freezing islands in a sea of white death. But on Stone Ridge, inside the widow's hole, there was calm. The wind shrieked like a banshee as it tore over the crest of the hill. But 10 feet below the surface, the air was still. The thick earthen roof, now piled with a massive insulating blanket of snow, held silent and strong. The deep granite walls radiated their gentle, constant warmth. Elara's small fire in the hearth burned steadily, its smoke drawn cleanly up the well-built chimney. She was entirely cut off from the outside world, but her world was complete. The chickens, unbothered, pecked at their feed. The green shoots in her garden grew, oblivious to the frozen apocalypse above. The cistern provided water that was cool but never frozen. She was not fighting the storm. She was living beneath its notice. In a pocket of life the blizzard could not touch. She was safe. The first knock on the door was so faint she thought she had imagined it, a trick of the wind. But then it came again, a desperate, frantic pounding. Silas erupted in a volley of deep-chested barks, standing rigid before the heavy door. Elara grabbed the axe, her heart hammering against her ribs. No person should be out in this. It had to be an animal, a bear perhaps, driven mad by the storm. She slowly unbarred the door, cracking it open just enough to peer out. A figure, more a mound of snow and ice than a man, collapsed against the frame and tumbled inside. It was Brant, the trapper. His face was a mask of frostbite, his lips blue and cracked. He was barely conscious, his breathing a shallow, rattling gasp. She dragged him inside, barring the door against the raging storm, and pulled him toward the fire. He was babbling, his words slurred and broken. Cabin, roof came down. Walked for hours. Lost. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound. As the warmth began to penetrate his frozen layers, his eyes focused on her, a flicker of disbelief warring with the pain. Then his story came out in fragments. The town was dying. People were freezing in their homes. The wood was gone. He spoke of the Gables. Their youngest daughter, Lily, was sick with a fever of the lungs. They were burning the last of their furniture to keep her room warm, but it wasn't enough. They're all trapped, he rasped, his eyes pleading. No one can get out. No one can get in. Elara looked at the man who had laughed at her, who had promised she'd be a frozen corpse by Christmas. She remembered Mr. Gable's sneer, the whispers of folly girl and cave girl. A bitter, cold anger rose in her. They had cast her out. They had mocked her survival as madness. Now they were paying the price for their own comfortable ignorance. She could leave them to it. She had enough food, enough wood. She had earned her safety. It was not her responsibility to save the people who had scorned her. But then she thought of the little girl, Lily, gasping for breath in a freezing room. She saw the child's face in her mind, and the anger crumbled, replaced by a stark, undeniable imperative. She could help. Therefore, she must. It was a moral equation as simple and unyielding as the granite walls around her. She had not built this sanctuary to gloat over the graves of her enemies. She had built it to live. And life, she now understood, had to be shared. She worked quickly. She treated Brant's frost-bitten hands and feet with a poultice of mashed turnips. She ladled warm broth, rich with the flavor of rabbit and kale, down his throat. Then she turned to her own stores. She pulled out a small, sturdy sled she had built from scavenged wood for hauling firewood. Onto it, she loaded a heavy canvas sack with logs, dry, dense pine that would burn hot and long. She added a basket lined with wool, filling it with a dozen precious eggs, a score of potatoes, and a bundle of fresh kale. She tucked in 2 of her thickest blankets. She wrapped herself in every layer of clothing she owned, pulling a heavy wool shawl over her head and face. She looked at Brant, now sleeping fitfully by the fire. "Stay here," she commanded. "Keep the fire fed." She turned to Silas, who was watching her every move, his tail giving a low, anxious thump. "Come, boy," she said softly. "We have to go." Opening the door was like opening the gate to hell. The wind tore at her, trying to rip the sled from her hands. The snow was a blinding, suffocating vortex. But Silas, his head low, plunged into the maelstrom, and she followed in his wake, leaning into the wind, a small, determined figure battling a frozen god. The journey to Providence Gulch was a nightmare. The landscape was alien, every landmark buried under mountainous drifts. The wind cut through her layers like a knife, and the cold was a constant, crushing pressure. More than once she stumbled and fell, the sled tipping, and only the thought of the sick child gave her the strength to rise and push on. Silas was her compass. He seemed to smell the way, picking a path through the treacherous, hidden terrain, his dark form the only thing visible in the swirling white. When they finally reached the town, it was a ghost city. Houses were half-buried mounds of snow, their windows dark. She made her way to the Mercantile, the largest building on the main street. Smoke, thin and black, curled from its chimney, the smoke of burning furniture, not firewood. She pounded on the door. It was opened by a haggard, hollow-eyed Mr. Gable. He stared at her, this figure crusted in ice and snow, as if she were an apparition. He did not seem to recognize her at first. Then his eyes fell to the sled, piled high with wood and food. His jaw dropped. Ilara pushed past him into the main room. The Gable family was huddled around the pot-bellied stove, which glowed a dull red. The air was thick with the acrid smell of varnish and burning cloth. Mrs. Gable was weeping softly, holding a small, still form wrapped in blankets. This was Lily. Ilara strode forward and laid her hand on the child's forehead. It was burning hot. Without a word, she began unloading the sled. She piled the logs next to the stove. She handed the basket of food to Mrs. Gable, whose eyes widened in disbelief at the sight of fresh eggs and green vegetables. The warmth of the eggs, protected in their woolen nest, was still palpable against her frozen fingers. She could not comprehend it. It was food from another world. Gable watched, speechless, as Ilara efficiently and expertly fed the stove with the proper firewood. A clean, healthy heat began to fill the room, pushing back the desperate cold. He looked at the potatoes, perfectly formed and caked with rich, dark earth. He looked at Ilara, her face raw from the wind, her expression calm and focused. The entire edifice of his certainty, his practical wisdom, his judgment of her, collapsed into dust. "We were wrong," he said, his voice a broken whisper. The words seemed torn from him. "I called your home a hole in the ground. I called you a fool." He looked at his sick daughter, then back at Ilara. A terrible, humbling understanding dawned in his eyes. "My God," he breathed, "we were the fools." Ilara did not acknowledge his confession. There was no time for shame or triumph. There was only the task at hand. "There is more wood," she said, her voice steady, "and I have broth. The child needs warmth and nourishment, not smoke." She organized the men, her voice taking on an authority that no one questioned. She led Gable and 2 others back into the storm, following the path Silas had broken. When they entered her shelter, they stopped dead, their mouths agape. The sudden transition from the howling, frozen hell outside to this warm, calm, life-filled space was a shock to the senses. The gentle warmth hit their faces. The soft lantern light revealed the impossible sight of the green garden, the clucking chickens in their coop, the neatly stacked cords of firewood, the shelves of preserved food. They stared, silent and stunned. It was not a hole in the ground. It was a miracle. This woman, this folly girl they had mocked, had not just survived. She had built a better world, a sanctuary that obeyed its own laws, a place where winter had no power. When the great blizzard finally broke, the sun shone on a shattered and humbled Providence Gulch. Ilara's shelter became the heart of the recovery. She shared her food, her warmth, and her knowledge without hesitation or reproach. She taught them how to find the deep burning pine, how to build a better chimney that wouldn't block with snow, how to insulate their walls with packed earth and moss. The name Widow's Hole died that winter. People began to call her home the Hearth, or Ilara's Haven. The men who had visited her underground sanctuary spoke of it with a reverent awe, describing the green garden as a thing of legend. Mr. Gable, his daughter now healthy and strong, became Ilara's greatest advocate. He used his mercantile to organize trade for her, ensuring she had everything she needed, never again questioning her wisdom. He told every traveler who passed through about the woman on Stone Ridge who had saved them, not with a gun or a fortune, but with a shovel and the courage to see what no one else could. In the years that followed, Providence Gulch rebuilt itself along different lines. The lessons of the blizzard of '83 were etched into the community's soul. New homes were built with deep, stone-lined cellars. Farmers began to dig their root cellars into south-facing hillsides, harnessing the passive warmth of the earth. The town learned to look down into the ground for the security they had once sought only in thick log walls. Ilara's folly had become the new wisdom of the region. Her story spread, carried by trappers and traders to other settlements. The tale of the cave girl of Providence Gulch became a frontier legend, a story of resilience and ingenuity. But for the people who knew her, she was something more. She was the quiet, steady heart of their community. Ilara never left Stone Ridge. Her haven grew. She expanded the cellar, built a small, sturdy cabin above the entrance, and cultivated a terraced garden on the slope, using the principles of insulation and thermal mass she had learned underground. She remained a woman of few words, her character defined not by what she said, but by what she had built and what she had given. Years later, an old woman, with hands as gnarled as the pines on her ridge, she would often stand at the entrance to her home at dusk. She would look out over the valley, at the lights of the town she had saved, and feel a deep, quiet peace. She had been given nothing but a curse, a worthless plot of land. But she had listened to the land, felt its secret warmth, and answered its silence with her own relentless labor. She had not conquered the wilderness. She had made a partnership with it. In the face of scorn, she had chosen diligence. In the face of vengeance, she had chosen grace. And in doing so, she had built more than just a shelter. She had built a life, and a legacy that would warm her people for generations to come.